Welcome to this evening's webinar on windows and doors, specifically how to choose windows and doors. It's the first of two webinars, with the second one being on Monday next week, and that's about installing windows and doors. So we hope that you can come along to both. We're really pleased to have Diane Hubbard of Green Footsteps to talk to us about how to choose your windows and the considerations that you might want to have in mind as you do so. And just to say that these webinars are funded by Energy Redress. So I'm Tina Holt, and I'm going to talk for up to 10 minutes just to do an introduction before I hand over to Diane. And then after about 50 minutes, we'll go into the Q&A. So it's your chance to ask your questions. And please do put your questions in the Q&A rather than the chat, because it's easiest for us to pick them up and deal with them in order. And then when we've run out of questions or come to 7:20, we'll wrap up with the final poll and some information about next events. For those of you who don't already know a bit about Cumbria Action for Sustainability, we don't just do webinars about retrofit. Our whole vision is a zero carbon Cumbria, and we have lots of different projects around that general aim. So do go on our website, do have a look around, do see what else we're doing. One of the things that I just like to promote while I'm here that is central to what CAFS is doing are the carbon literacy courses. And we've actually got a course taking place on the 27th of March, so that's very soon. Or just look on the CAFS website on the events page to look for any dates when those courses are running, and we can run them for groups, organizations, community groups, and so on. So we can run a specific one if you're interested, and that the details are there. So just look out for those, because they cover the whole of the sustainable lifestyle, not just retrofitting homes. Within the energy services team where I work, we have some free energy saving advice and help out there for people. So everything from our main Cold to Cozy Homes service for people who are eligible, and people who want to just ask a simple question about one or two things, you can give us a call. Or if you want to know about retrofit generally, we can spend a while just talking through your questions on the phone. So do get in touch with us for that. That's all free. And for some people who want to go on to our energy audit service, that's a paid service where we create a whole house energy model and helps with decision making around retrofit, then we've got that, and the thermal imaging service as well. And of course we do courses and webinars. This one is funded, but others aren't, and any donations that you give when you log on to one of our courses, for example, we're really grateful for it, because it means we can do more with what we've got. So moving on, Diane is a mechanical engineer by training, and started out looking at building physics and existing buildings and understanding how important they are for reducing our environmental impact. She studied at CAT, the Centre for Alternative Technology, and now works as Green Footsteps. And the work that Diane normally does, apart from speaking on courses like this, is to do airtightness testing and infrared thermography and other energy calculations for new builds and for those people who are doing retrofit. And for anyone who's interested in passive house, she's also got the qualifications there, and knows a lot about ventilation as well. So really very knowledgeable on all of these topics. So without saying any more, I'm going to hand over to you, Diane, and yeah, put up your presentation.
Okay, great. Thanks very much, Tina. So good evening, everybody. Hopefully you should be seeing my screen.
Yeah.
Is that right? Yeah?
Yes.
Okay, yes. Okay, so I'm going to talk about replacement windows and doors this evening. Okay, so Tina's kindly just filled in a little bit of my background as to what I do. And yeah, so really just recapping on that, I do quite a lot on airtightness. And though though I'm talking about windows and doors, actually, the reason I'm talking about it is primarily due to sort of airtightness issues. At the end of the presentation, I've got a sort of 2 or 3 case studies where I've had to carry out investigations following problems. So it was really airtightness issues that got me started on particularly looking at windows and doors. So, I mean, I'm not a windows and doors expert. Can I just make that clear? I basically have come to this because of the issues that that they seem to present people with. One of the most common things I get is somebody ringing me up saying, I've spent quite a lot of money on, say, a new set of patio doors, and they are a problem. You know, it's quite cool where I'm sitting in my kitchen. What can I do about it? And really, I got a little bit sick of doing these sort of investigations, to be honest. And it struck me that it would be a lot better to address and better inform people who are purchasing their windows and doors so that they make better decisions. It's better from the planet's point of view, it's better from their point of view, and it's putting in best practice. So that's the reason I'm really talking about these. As I say, I'm not a windows and doors expert. The thing that we're talking about, the problems that come up, the most common one I find is over sliding patio doors. But so much relates to the initial specification by the householder. So really, that's the crux of what I'm going to be talking about. I'm focusing on windows because basically doors are windows with a little bit less glass. So in principle, you know, there's a lot of commonalities between the two, but the focus of this presentation is really going to be talking about windows because of they are very similar things, different issues over thresholds and things. But for the purposes of this evening's presentation, I'm putting that to one side. I'm assuming that you've already decided you're going to buy some new windows. You're not going to go for secondary glazing. I'm sort of putting that one to one side. You've decided that you're going to buy some new windows. This presentation, I'm trying to cover everybody who's doing everything from an Eco-Retrofit, a deep retrofit, through to making a decision about a single window on a very tight budget. I'm trying to avoid jargon this evening, but there are some key things that really you do need to try and understand, and hopefully I'll explain those as I go through. So I'm trying to keep it as jargon-free as possible. One thing you'll notice is I'm using in some examples that I cite of sort of costs and types of windows, I'm using some information from Green Building Store. It's purely coincidental that they're doing the presentation on Monday. I didn't realise that when I sorted out the presentation. I am not saying go for Green Building Store windows and doors specifically. But the reason I've used them as part of this presentation is because they've made information available to me, which I really appreciate, and they also make their specs openly available, which is quite unusual for a lot of windows and door suppliers. So that's the reason why I'm using them, and I'd just like to pass on my thanks for their cooperation on that. Okay, so what am I going to talk about? So these are the key points that I'm going to cover. Understanding what you are ordering is the first thing. Thinking about what high-level decisions you need to make, things that are broader than just the decision about what type of window or door to go for. Performance criteria you should be looking at. Very briefly, touching on installation. I know there's the presentation on Monday goes into detail on installation, but there's some aspects that relate to what you're proposing to purchase. So I'm just very briefly going to cover those, and then I'm going to look at some case studies. Now, the case studies are based on actual jobs that I've had to test. So I've shown some thermal images, and I can provide a little bit more background information to relate to the other things that we've talked about as part of the presentation. So I think one of the problems we get with windows and doors is that you look at an energy sort of performance certificate like this for the window, and invariably they're A+ or A++. They all look like they perform superbly, whatever the format of the certificate actually takes. But is that really accurate? You know, the sales rep will focus on this, on how great they are, but really we need to look beyond that sort of the certificate itself. What does the window actually give us? Well, it lets light in. We get solar gain through it, but we also have to think of the window as a negative thing, because windows, compared to, say, wall fabric, perform very poorly because of their nature, because of what they do, because of the fact that they are glass and they need to let light through. So we need to think about how that performance of the window compares to the fabric around the window itself. So what I want to do is to talk a little bit more about sort of key aspects of the performance. U values is something that's important. Now, I'd just like to explain what a U value is, because that's something that you know, it's a technical term and people may not be used to it. Basically, the U value, the thermal transmittance, is a way of describing how energy efficient a particular thing is. In this instance, we're talking about the window. It basically relates to, if you've got a bigger number, it says it's actually going to be letting more heat through, it's going to be more conductive. And if you have a small number, it's going to be less conductive. To sort of put some specific figures on that, if you're looking at a single glazed window, that's got a U value of about 6. And if you're looking at sort of a high spec triple glazed window, you've got a U value of sort of 1 or a bit less than 1. So you would lose 1/6 of the energy through that window under the same conditions and the same area of window. So the U value is really important, but we have to break down that U value a little bit more, in that we've got the glazing performance itself, and then we've got the performance of the frame. Now, the thing to bear in mind is that with pretty energy efficient glazing, the frame is actually performing worse than the glazing is. So what you really want to do is to make sure that the frame area is actually minimized, because then you get the better performance from the window. But going back to the certificate that we were looking at before on the previous slide, you need to bear in mind that things like those energy performance certificates are produced based on a standard window size, forgetting what your window size actually is. They use a standard window size. So, for example, if you've got a big area of glazing and so a small frame, you know, something like a large sort of fixed window, then the performance of that window in reality will be better than on the certificate, because it will have a smaller frame area compared to the glazing. Whereas if you have lots of small windows, then the frame area will be quite a bit bigger as a percentage of the area. So the U value of the window will be worse than is stated on that certificate. So if you're doing, if you have sort of extremes of those circumstances and you're looking in detail at the energy performance of your building, you need to take that into account. So things like more in-depth calculations, such as if you're looking at a deep retrofit and say to passive house standards, so ENERFIT sort of standards, then you would want to be taking into account the size of the glazing involved and the frame sizes and everything. I think for the more general purposes, really it's a case of thinking about the style of window that you're looking at, and bearing in mind that the frame is really important and is the worst performing part of that window. So we need to minimize frame and maximize glass ideally. Another important characteristic is the spacer conductivity. So that the spacer is the thing that is separating the portions of the glazing. So we can see in this triple glazed window, the spacer is at the bottom here. It's not always obvious what the spacer conductivity actually is, but it can be quite important, because if you've got aluminium spacers, that would be more highly conductive than insulated spacers. So understanding the spacers and what you're buying is important. With the performance of frames, it's also possible to get thermally broken frames. Now that means that they are not conducting heat that as readily through the frame itself. So for example, if it was an aluminium frame, then that's really important. You can also get thermally broken timber glazing frames as well. Again, it's understanding what's important. Look at the U value for the frame itself as well as the glazing, and understand what you're ordering. And going back to that, the certificate that we looked at before, beware of the manufacturer's U value calculations, because they are based on a standard window size. Ooh. Okay, so what do we need to consider when we're ordering? Now, my speciality is airtightness particularly. So the things that sort of govern the airtightness they're actually going to get, because not all, you know, the airtightness of windows does vary. It's going to be determined like things like the style of the window itself or the door, and I'm going to come back to that with a couple of slides a little bit later on. But we've also got things like the door furniture and the type of lock. You know, is it a multi-point lock? What are the seals on the window actually like? I've had sort of instances recently with very high spec roof lights, for example, not green molding steel ones, another manufacturer, but roof lights that are quadruple glazed, but there is an issue with the seals with them. And you know, on buildings that are passive house standard, small leaks on seals can be you know, can be a concern. So think about what's your objective, what standard are you looking at, and then you need to be specifying things to fulfill those standards. Now, the inward or outward opening is quite an important question. When we sort of think about the UK, our windows open out and our doors open in usually. And if you look sort of elsewhere in Europe, you'll find that windows tend to open in and doors open out. It seems to be a cultural thing. But this is quite an important thing to think about, because, you know, what are you thinking of doing with your building? For example, if you've got, if you're thinking about external wall insulation, if your windows open inwards, then it's actually easier to wrap the insulation into the window reveals and lose more of the frame within the insulation. So you're going to get a better performance there. You're going to get more of the window frame hidden, the bit that doesn't perform very well. If they're outward opening and maybe you're going to do your external wall insulation at a later stage, then are your windows going to be able to open outwards when you fit the insulation? So thinking more widely about what your plans are in that instance is really important. When we think about coatings, low E coating should be standard, but just check. We have something called a G value. When you've with glazing, we've got you know, we've talked about U values, but a G value is the ability basically to for the window to transmit radiation to inside the building. So what you might have is a situation where you've got a large area of south-facing glazing and you want to reduce the overheating risk. And you can adjust that in various ways. You could sort of shade it on the outside. You could do it with planting or a pergola or something like that. Or you could do it by changing the G value. And that would mean you were able to reduce the amount of radiation that was admitted into the building, so reducing the overheating risk. So that's something that's worth considering. Again, I mentioned, you know, if you're doing a detailed building analysis, such as for something like Enofit, you would potentially look at different G values for your glazing to look at the effect that that has on the overheating within the building. The thing to bear in mind as a whole is that the devil is actually in the detail. I mentioned at the outset that I've sort of come into this through people raising problems over their glazing and asking me to investigate. And I have to say that I found it quite shocking sometimes, the basis on which people have ordered and spent thousands, and in some cases tens of thousands of pounds on glazing. It's absolutely key. If you want to ensure you get what you want, you need to make sure that it is there in the specification. If it isn't mentioned, you have to assume it's not going to be there. So get everything in writing. So clear specification. Yes, sorry, Tina.
Yes, I thought it'd be useful to ask a question that's already come into the Q&A just for understanding. What exactly is an e-coating?
It's a low emissivity coating. It's a standard coating. It's a thin film of metal, actually. It's sort of, I don't know, an atom or 2 atoms thick. And basically, it's applied to one of the surfaces. If we think about double glazing, it's applied to one of the surfaces within the sort of around that void in the middle of the glazing unit. And what it does is it reflects heat back into the building. So it reduces the loss through the windows back to outside. That's what it does through that very thin metallic coating. Does that explain it?
Yep, I think that'll do for now.
Sorry, I should have explained that a bit more. That's one I've missed. Okay. Right, next. Okay, so if we think, maybe if we go sort of a step back and think about higher level decisions that we maybe need to think about. And if you're remodeling your home, which a lot of people are, you know, it's a great thing to do. You know, if you're going to be looking at upgrading the thermal performance, it's an ideal opportunity to remodel, you know, several aspects of the building. Be careful about seriously increasing the amount of glazing that you have. And that's for a few reasons, really. At the end of the day, it's your choice. It's your choice as to what you do. But there's a few things to sort of think about. I mentioned at the outset about poor performance of the glass compared to, say, a wall. Okay. And particularly if you're going to be insulating that wall. And in terms of U values, you know, if we look at sort of what you might be aiming for, if we're thinking about high spec glazing, let's use a U value of 1, for example. Now, a high spec wall would be, you know, maybe 0.1, maybe 0.2. Normal building regs at the moment, about 0.3. So your glazing is sort of, even with sort of very high spec glazing, you're looking at 3 times the energy loss through the glazing, or maybe 10 times if you're looking at sort of normal building regs, sort of standard. So you're talking about a big increase in energy loss. So So from a carbon footprint point of view, bear that in mind. Do you really need that glass there? I've not mentioned on this list, there's also the cost side of it. Glazing is very expensive compared to plain wall. Do you really need that additional glazing? The other key thing to highlight is overheating risk. Now, you might say, hey, we live in Cumbria, for goodness sake, what's overheating risk? This is a really serious problem, and it's going to be more serious. I've been in so many houses that have had retrofits, and there's quite a large area of glazing being included, and it's not very nice to go into a room in March and think, this space just is so uncomfortable. I wonder what it's like in July. Is it still usable? So thinking about the overheating risk is really important. Again, you can model it, you can look at it on paper before you make a decision, but really, think twice. I mean, I know that's that child's drawing on the left-hand side there, but think seriously about the overheating risk, because the potential is there. You are insulating your home so it retains the heat. You get sunny days, it will retain the heat on sunny days as well. You have to be really careful. Model it if possible. But if you're working off rules of thumb, bear in mind, you don't really, the sort of figures from the Passive House Trust, 15–20% of floor area should be your windows. In a lot of cases, it can be substantially more than that. At the end of the day, it's your decision, but really think carefully about the issue potentially of overglazing and what the consequences are. So window style is another factor. I've touched before on the frame percentage, but the window style also governs, it governs the performance of what we've got and also the cost. So let's explore that in a little bit more detail. So we've got an example here of a window, okay, and we're going to look at various different scenarios. Okay, so what we have here is we've got, on the left-hand side, we've got a basic fixed window, okay, non-opening, and you can sort of see we've got the U value of the window. When it says UW, that means U value for the window as a whole. If it was for the glazing only, it would be called UG, and if it was the frame, it would be called UF. So we're talking about for the window as a whole there. So on the left-hand side, we've got a fixed window with a U value of 0.79, and you can see as we move over to through the different styles, the U value is increasing as the amount of frame increases. And you can see as we move over the percentage of glass that we've got, it goes from 3/4 to barely over half the window is actually glazing. So you've got that issue of the frame there. You could use false glazing bars, so not actually breaking into the glazing, but the simplicity of the window is important. And then you start to look at costs. Now, the costs are only just indicative. I mean, prices and things are changing at the moment, but you can see how much the cost increases aside from the U value, the reduction, the poorer performing U value. So style is really important for what we're, things we need to consider. So when we're looking at glazed doors, aesthetics can be really important. Depending on what you've got, you might be wanting sort of, might have a beautiful view out of the door, and you want to minimize how much that is broken by the frame. Budget, and performance are also important. So we look at glazed doors in a similar way to how we've just looked at the windows. Now we've sort of got 4 different styles here. I'll just explain what we've got here. We've got a single door with a side light, a double door, so a conventional French window. We've got bifold doors, what we'd commonly call bifold doors, fold aside doors. And then we've got tilt and turn. Now the tilt and turn, I think strictly speaking, is considered as a window rather than a door, but in effect it can open like a door, but it doesn't have a conventional door threshold. Now, in terms of what I see routinely, the styles, you know, people really like bifold doors because of the fact that they fold out of the way. The other style that styles that I sort of see quite a lot of are conventional sliding doors, sliding patio doors, and what's called lift and slide. So where it would be a slider, but there is a lifting mechanism on it to start off with before the door then is able to slide. But let's look at these examples that we've got here in a similar way to before. So what we've got here is we've got, again, a sort of similar pattern about the similar pattern with the performance as the amount of frame increases. But look at the cost side of things. You know, again, they're only indicative costs, but you can see that the bifold doors for the same area are substantially more expensive and relatively poor performing compared to other options. Let's look at a little bit more on the doors. So what we've got here is a comparison of the for the same area. We've got a double door set. So here we've got French windows in the middle that fold back and out of the way onto the glazed areas at the side. So you get quite a large open area in the middle, but there's still glazed portions to it. We've got a fold aside door set. So that's the bifold doors, as we'd call them, where the whole area folds aside. And then we've got a lift and slide door set where basically one panel lifts and then slides over the other panel. So again, we've got you know, quite a difference in cost between those particular types of door, and some variation in the U value. But in terms of airtightness testing, I see lots and lots of problems with bifold doors, the fold aside door sets. Just generally, I'm not talking about specific manufacturers, but in terms of what you're actually asking them to do, the doors to do, there's lots of fixing points, there's lots of hinges. They're really quite complicated compared to, say, a set of conventional French windows. So from an airtightness point of view, the thing that I see is standard French windows are the easiest thing to get airtight, generally speaking, sort of when you're looking at comparable specs, because they're straightforward. You've got 2 doors that in effect then lock into place. The next, well, the worst I tend to see is bifolds, the fold aside door sets. The lift and slides are really usually pretty good. But just standard sliders tend to be quite leaky, but not as leaky as bifolds, generally speaking. And I'm just talking, these are just generalizations because it does depend on the spec of the window. And we'll come on to a little bit more about technical specs on that and what you should be looking for. But that's broadly what I see when I'm testing buildings. So in terms of other high-level decisions, you have to think beyond the windows. You have to get a whole house plan. The example I cited before about the external wall insulation and will your windows still open? and sequencing, getting that right. You need to think beyond this one step, because otherwise there's a risk that you're going to end up wasting money, or you're going to end up redoing things. So the whole house plan, you know, as Tina mentioned at the beginning, you know, the service that CAFs offer with that's one of the options to pursue. But you need to think about what your strategy for the building is for the longer term. In terms of performance criteria, the most common question I get asked is my double glazing performing okay when I'm testing buildings? And my answer to that is, that's a really difficult thing to answer, because it's so difficult. When I'm using thermography on a building and I look at windows, I see reflections of what's around, whether that's inside or outside. And it's very difficult to actually answer that question. I can tell you whether they're airtight, that's not a problem, but it's really quite difficult to know, to be able to check what you've got. So the key is to buy from somebody you trust, somebody who is reliable, somebody who is reputable. And that's absolutely key, because you're going to have to take quite a lot in terms of accepting what they say. So again, it's back to specification. So I mentioned before about the difference in airtightness. Now, these specs, so particularly this airtightness standard that I'm showing on the slide at the moment, this is a European standard that I have to say is usually very well hidden in specifications. And the reason I've come across this was because when I've had to investigate issues on clients' behalves, and by no means lots of suppliers are not working to this standard. If you're looking at high spec, the thing is to start looking through the documentation for this particular standard, because it will indicate that they have tested the product properly, and they're at least aware of that. You're sort of looking for, it's a good indicator. If you're looking at if your aim is high specification and you ask them about whether they comply to this standard, if they look at you in a blank way, then you probably need to consider some other suppliers. Part of this as well is a weather tightness standard, so that's, does it actually leak? But it's worth checking through the documentation to see if this is referred to, and back to specifications, make sure you've got some documentary evidence of compliance to the standard. It's heartbreaking when people ring me and say they, you know, they've spent £10,000–15,000 on glazing, and when I look into it, there is nothing behind that. They have ordered on the basis of just an outline quote from a window supplier. So detail is important. Just briefly touching on installation, but just simply in terms of relevance to the specification. There is a benefit in the window supplier installing the windows, particularly, I mean, in one of the case studies, I'll sort of cover this, but there's a real benefit in it. It's all in one place. If there is a problem, then, you know, if you've bought it from somebody and somebody else has installed it, then they can blame each other. And particularly if you're looking at large areas of glazing, the tolerances on installation are really quite tight in terms of windows performing. So that really is the best route to go down. And you know, I mean, the next Monday's presentation will clearly go into lots of detail, but you know, make sure when you're ordering windows you get confirmation of how they're actually being fixed, you know, how they will be made airtight, and make sure it's documented at the quotation stage. Again, I'll just touch on that when I cover one of the case studies. And when we're talking about installation, you know, make sure it's specified that they're going in the right place in the wall. This example that I've got here, this drawing, what you've got, ideally the window should be fitted in line with the insulation, wherever that is, or wherever it might be. Thinking about your whole house plan again, what you might be doing in the near future could govern where the window actually sits. But in this instance, what you've got is the window is in effect too far out. So you can actually, there's actually a thermal bridge there. You're going to have a cold spot on the inside of the wall in that instance. So making sure the window is physically installed in the right place is key. So window position. We also need to make sure that internal and external reveals are insulated or have the capability to be insulated. We need to think about the fixing method. It's important to think about the air tightness on that and the use of appropriate air tightness materials. And what are you going to be doing in the future? Does it all fit in with that? And they're all important things that you need to think about before you place the order. So a couple of case studies, just a few minutes on this. So what I've got here is this is a new build property. It's not a retrofit. And these are, this is a large area of glazing. It was about 7 or 8 meters wide, very high spec. So it's class 4, that's the highest spec of air tightness. This is a thermal image on the right hand side of the daylight. It's the same position as the daylight image on the left hand side. And what we're seeing is we've got the dark areas are where there is air leakage actually around the glazing. We're talking about here, and here. Now this is a test. The building was being air tightness tested at the time of the thermography. So the pressure is lower inside the building compared to outside. So air is being drawn in. So under normal circumstances, you wouldn't necessarily see these leaks unless the wind was blowing onto that particular window. And this is one advantage of doing an air tightness test on the building. We can actually see the air coming through around that glazing, and this enabled the builder to raise a complaint. These particular windows were they were made in Austria, but installed by a UK installer. And at first it was, well, we never had a problem with our glazing, but the thermal images enabled the builder to raise the issues. So having evidence is quite important. That there was clearly buried in their documentation, they did comply to this EN standard, and that enabled the builder to make sure that things were rectified. It took quite a lot of work to get over the problems in this particular instance. The second case study is a retrofit, and it's, yes.
Yeah, can I just raise one really important question as we go along? Hilary asks, what are the reveals?
The reveals are, sorry, it's, if you think about the window, and the bits of wall that are around the window are is the window reveal. So it's the lead in to the window. Is that all right?
Thank you. Yep.
So this second case study I've got here is it's a single patio door. This is a retrofit where the client put an extension onto the building as well. This is an investigation, a retrospective investigation from my point of view. The client had tried to, had basically said to the installer, the windows are leaking, his seating areas is adjacent to the window. He said, I've spent sort of £5,000 on this window, or sliding door rather, and it's not what I was expecting. and was basically getting nowhere. So I was called in to produce a formal report to try and get things to move. And so I was trying to produce evidence for the client to take things forward. It had been installed by somebody, it had been produced, but they were still in effect an agent. It was European glazing, and there were leaks primarily around this area. In effect, what I did was I tested the building, and then I covered over the whole area of glazing to see the difference in the result between the building before and afterwards, to put a figure on whether the building was compliant in terms of the class of glazing that it was. This was class 4 glazing as well, so the highest spec, and it clearly fell outside. It barely complied to class 1 glazing. So it enabled, it confirmed, the test confirmed that there was an issue present for the client. Unfortunately, it still proved difficult to resolve. In this third case study, what I've got is, this is an inward opening French window. These are class 4 again. Again, European manufactured windows and doors. One thing that was evident with this was when I looked through the specification, the client, when as part of the installation, they hadn't, the installation spec wasn't great. They'd picked sort of a lower spec option in terms of airtightness. And so there was that was not ideal to start off with. But this particular door set was leaking. On top of that, on top of the installation issue, this particular door set was leaking at the bottom. Again, this is under depressurization conditions, under an air tightness test. So what we've got here is at the base of this door, we have the air is being drawn in, and this route here, that's the cold air cooling the floor that we can see. What happened in the end with this particular client was the images were used. This was a new build property, and the images were used to show the window manufacturer, and their rectification team came in, and then I basically followed their rectification team around the building as they rectified each window, and I confirmed whether the performance had improved. But these were class 4 specifications, so really airtight they should have been, but they were still problematic. And in the same building, this was a large area of glazing. Because of the nature of the glazing, it was a corner of glazing, big area with glazing meeting, just basically to take advantage of the wonderful view from the property. Class 3 glazing, so not such a high spec. But what had happened was that a corner of the glazing had dropped after installation, and as a result, the air was streaming through this section. The section to the left-hand side was movable, and the section to the right was fixed. And air was streaming through this area here, which this is what the thermal image is showing, how cold air is actually coming in, again under test conditions, but because of how the glazing had been purchased, the client got the situation was rectified quite swiftly in this particular instance, and it was attributed to that particular problem. But if it had been a separate installer from the manufacturer of the glazing, it would have been a lot more difficult to get the situation resolved. So what I've tried to do is I've tried to help you to understand what you might be ordering, really, and the importance of making sure that you have clear specs, you get everything in writing. But you also need to think about the higher level stuff. You know, are you putting the right amount of glazing in? What style of glazing are you looking at? And thinking about the performance criteria as well. And installation, well, that's covered next time in more detail. So I hope that that's been helpful to you, and I look forward to some questions.
Well, thank you very much, Diane. That's been really useful, really clear, really interesting. If you have other questions that come to mind later, remember that obviously there's a webinar next week on Monday, but we've also got other webinars coming up as well. Do look on the CAFS event page. You can ring us up, you can get an advice call with one of our energy advisors, a free retrofit consultation by phone with me, or you can ask for us to quote for the full energy audit that we carry out. So those are our contact details, and we will be sending out this presentation by email, so you'll be able to see that information again. Then the future webinars that we've got, after Mondays, we've got a bit of a gap, and then we've got an overview of the retrofit journey for householders in April, and really importantly, introduction to construction contracts in May. So that's one that's well worth coming along to if you're taking on builders and the like. And also just to mention, I actually got the date wrong for the carbon literacy training. It's in April, and there's a couple of spaces left. So if you'd be interested in that, do take a look. Also, if you sign up to our newsletter on the CAFS homepage, you will always get reminders about our forthcoming events. And if you're interested, we have a Facebook group, Cumbria Green Build, and the link is there. And that's where you can put questions to each other and to us as well about your retrofit questions and just sort of using the network really to get answers. So in terms of next steps, do sign up to our newsletter to get more information about future webinars. See you at another webinar. We'll email out after this, the recording will be emailed out tomorrow or next week. So you'll be able to just click on that link and see the whole webinar again if you want to. And we will also send out the link to our survey because we're getting householder opinions. That's an anonymous survey. So please, if you haven't already done so, do answer our survey. We'd love to know your responses to that. Get in touch with us if you want to ask us questions about our advice service. And thank you so much for those of you who've made a donation to CAFS when you booked on to the webinar. I think so it'd be nice to say just a very final thank you to Diane. That's been really, really useful, really interesting. And thank you everyone for attending, and thank you for your excellent questions.